La diferencia es que grito o hablo despacio, ¿no? Entonces tenemos, well, I'm going to speak in English and then kind of go back, right? We have about 2,100 members, 19 professional chapters, 21 universities, and about 35% of our members are students. And so I know that we have a couple NHJ students here, so raise your hands. NHJ members? All right, thank you. All right, so our panel today is Latino Voices in the Newsroom. And we're going to start with the assumption that there aren't enough. And so we're going to just jump right in and actually have a dialogue with the panel. And at different times, if you guys have questions, we can actually incorporate those into the discussion. So we have some questions, but it's really important to hear from you also. What are the things you're most curious about? What we can do, what can change, and what are the things that we really still have to fight against? So we're going to start with the panel and asking, what do you think are the greatest barriers to really diversifying the newsrooms? Who wants to take that on?
Okay, I'll start with a couple of things that I do feel like Stacy's like one of the knows more about this. I would say that obviously coming from a mainstream news source that's not necessarily fully catering Latinos at all times or focused on catering Latinos, I think it's a little bit, you know, we need more effort from these companies to hire like Latinos and diverse newsrooms from all backgrounds, and not just Latinos, Afro-Latinos, Latinos from different socioeconomic backgrounds, because there's just not enough of them. And you know, obviously, we need a little more effort from the companies. We need a little more Latinos, not just in Latino-related coverage, but also in, you know, in the Hill, like Lori, and we need people to just cover business, to cover everything with a perspective of Latinos.
I still think sometimes companies think Latinos all look the same.
Yeah, that's
sound the same or come from the same region, right? And look at just this panel alone, you can see the diversity of who we are. Organizationally, well, you're an adopted Latino. El Caribe is the Caribbean. So tell us, organizationally speaking, what are some of the things you're seeing?
I mean, fundamentally, newsrooms are incredibly lazy. I'm not sure, are you hearing me now? Yeah, so newsrooms are super lazy and always fighting fires. And whenever you're fighting fires, you think that everything else is super important. And the thing that's super important is getting the story out, getting the publication done, and not necessarily thinking about your hiring strategy, or you think you are thinking about your hiring strategy. I think the two things I've seen, and I have a lot of opinions about this, but the two things I've seen most frequently are that newsrooms think about diversity in very unidimensional ways. You know, they're like, oh, well, we need to hire women, which usually just means like English-speaking white women. Or we need to hire a black person. Or we need to hire somebody who is not based in New York. And then the other part of that is where we post job descriptions is a real problem. So if you are the kind of person who spends all your time on Twitter, you'll see a lot of media jobs floating around. You'll see a lot of editors sharing things. If you are not that kind of person, like you're a normal human being and you're trying to break into media, and you don't know who you should be following, and you don't know that, you know, every now and then somebody will say, hey, I'm hiring so-and-so, DM me. That is not a super effective way of making sure that you're reaching representative candidates, or that you're reaching the people who would cover your audiences more effectively. And one of the responsibilities that we have as editors, as reporters, as people who care about this, is to argue, and it's to raise our hands and say, hey, I saw that we just posted this job, like, did we send it to the NAHJ? You know, did we send it to AAJA? Did we try even slightly to maybe write this in some of the other languages that might be relevant to who we're trying to hire and where we're trying to find people?
So can I jump in here real quick to just build on something that Stacy was saying is, I think the hiring sometimes, I would describe it as emotional or schizophrenic, in the sense that when President Barack Obama was running for office the first time, all of a sudden we saw a sea of faces of color as analysts. Then there was a push to hire more African-American journalists. Now with immigration issue, and the immigration issue has been around for over, you know, more than 30 years. I mean, I think it's been here always within the Latino community, maybe since 1986 after Reagan did the amnesty bill, but it's always been there. But lately, since it has, the topic has risen, the number of Latinos immigrating has risen, then we see this push to maybe get Latinos to cover that issue. So that's why I say that it's schizophrenic, because it sometimes depends on what's going on in the nation. So then after President Obama went into his second term, if many of you are watchers or viewers of cable television, you notice that then all of a sudden, the number of Latino or African American analysts sort of just disappeared.
I mean, fundamentally what you're saying is that newsrooms are also mad racist, right? Because then basically it's like, oh, we have a black president, maybe we should hire some black people because they can only talk about black presidents. Or, we think immigration is a thing that only affects Hispanic audiences and Latino audiences, so maybe we should hire some of them.
Or even the reflection that after President-elect Trump.
Slow down, sorry.
Everybody slow down.
Okay, I'm working on it.
All right.
It's a Trinidadian problem. And so this continues to be a challenge when we think about hiring and we think about inclusive newsrooms. We think about inclusive newsrooms for people who we want to cover very specific beats. And we don't cultivate reporters across all beats. We don't say that, hey, we think about diversity candidates, which is one of the worst phrases in history. And we don't think, hey, we need to hire investigative journalists. We think we need to hire immigration correspondents, and that pisses me off.
I also find that like working for a mainstream, national newspaper, it's always like, well, you should help us find those candidates, and it's like, why is it my responsibility? I don't work in HR, it's not my responsibility to go to these places and find these people. It shouldn't be my job to do that, but it is. It ends up being your responsibility as a Latino to kind of help, and of course, I will gladly do it. But I can only do so much, and I feel like if there were, a little more help on the HR department, on like reaching out to certain people, all beats, it would be much easier to have a truly diverse newsroom.
But then and there is the problem. And this is what I try to even tell the interns that come into our office, and that is, in my case in television, look, you know what? I know that you want to be in front of the camera. Maybe that was your goal since the time you were a little girl or a little boy. But you also have to remember that there are people who are behind the camera who have a lot of power. And that's the issue. Who is in HR? Who's running HR? So, that's part of the issue. It's people who are in the key positions that could help promote what Stacy and what Carolina are talking about.
And one of the other things, we just heard a presentation from Vox Media about like the importance of performance, but you can't have people who think about mobile are people who spend a lot of time on their phones. And if you heard from the Pew Research people yesterday, the audiences that are even more mobile than everybody else are audiences from generally underrepresented communities. And I don't think we always think about how, when we talk about diversity in newsrooms, we tend to have an exclusively editorial focus, but it has to go across the entire organization, right? Like one of the reasons I've cared about mobile for a long time is because I grew up on an island that skipped desktops and went straight to smartphones, or phones and then smartphones. And then whenever I went home, I couldn't use like my own apps. I couldn't use Slack. Slack for a long time was horrible on less than 3G connections. And you know that these things happen, and the way that we build our sites is because we optimize for people who look like us, and we optimize for people who come from similar socioeconomic backgrounds. And we talk about it from a lens of, well, our coverage needs to be representative, but the stuff we're building also needs to be built by people who represent the audiences that we're trying to serve. And I also want to challenge us that when we're thinking about these issues, we move outside of just the reporters and the editors into every single person who affects how the news reaches the people that we're trying to cover.
And I hear a lot from students that they're concerned that if they cover the Latino community, that they're just going to get pigeonholed into covering the Latino community. And we have some Latinos who don't speak English, don't speak Spanish, don't really know much about the community, yet they're getting sent out to cover a community that they don't really know. But again, they're afraid that they want to cover news. They don't want to just do immigration or what happened in their neighborhood. What advice do you have, or what would you say to some of these students?
Well, I want to just say something you just said. There you have people who don't speak Spanish who are being sent out into the community to cover stories. Well, I hate to tell you this, But a lot of those people actually sold themselves to the news director as being able to cover the Hispanic community. Let's be honest here. Vamos a hablar sin tapujo. There are people who take
Puras verdades
advantage.
aquí, puras verdades.
Aquí hay gente que usan su apellido, Sanchez, Rivera, and I'm not saying that's bad or wrong, but they're representing themselves as something that they are not, and that's what some people are doing that to get hired. Now, with regards to the question of getting pigeonholed, I think it depends on the market that you're in. It really boils down, in television, it depends on where you're at. I mean, if you're in Miami, aquí mismo en Nueva York, si estás en LA o Texas, en Houston, por ejemplo, Dallas, it's kind of hard, I think, for you to get pigeonholed because there's so many other Hispanic reporters at that station that sooner or later you will be covering other things. It depends on what part of the country that you are in, and it's a shame to think that Stacy has to go and cover the Jamaican community in Brooklyn because she's from an island, and all the island people
Check.
are
Well, but the box is checked, right? The box is checked. We got one of those.
And let me say this to you. I remember something just came across my mind now. I remember that when I started out in radio, and when I went to get my second job, I went to they're not there anymore, so I can say names. WNWS radio. It was all news radio in Miami, Florida, on US 1. And I remember going there, and the news director was a man who was white American. I get there to the station, he comes out. This guy didn't even ask me my name. I mean, I think I asked for him. He had an appointment at 1 o'clock. He figured this is my 1 o'clock appointment. He just took one look at me. He said, you speak Spanish? Sí. When can you start? Okay. So like 3 days later, there was a young lady who was the secretary of the GM, the general manager. She comes around. Mind you, when I show up, I'm only the second person of color in this station. She said, you know why you got hired, right? He checked off woman, he checked off Hispanic, and he's checked off black.
Yep.
So when we're talking about checking off the boxes, those things happen. And then months later, it hit me and it hurt. Because he didn't look at me as if I was somebody who could do the job. He looked at me as somebody who was filling a quota.
On the flip side, if you're actually, for me, I actually cover Latino issues. So if I'm obviously, I've tokenized myself within my newsroom in a sense, because I would rather somebody come to me with a Spanish translation than for them to Google translate something and make everybody look ridiculous and the whole community insulted. But obviously, it shouldn't be only my responsibility. There should be more Latinos in the newsroom. There should be more Latinos across other beats that they don't have to lean on me to do those things. But if you're somebody who is interested in covering the Hill, if you're interested in covering business, and you're not necessarily interested in covering Latino issues, then I think it's a matter of just sticking to what you want, because you should obviously it might take you a little longer because right now maybe it's a little trendy to be hiring these Latino journalists for their language or their culture, but stick to what you want. There's plenty of people, especially now, that do those things in different beats. And then once you're in a newsroom, honestly, like maybe it's just me because I'm a little bit, loudmouth, but just speak up, because whenever there's layoffs or there's a new hire, or even with our union, I'm always talking about diversity and the fact that we need more diversity, and it makes people uncomfortable. Even in the most progressive newsrooms, it makes people uncomfortable. But you just got to keep doing it, and it's not something that we should need to do, but it's something that is necessary at this point.
It's reality. The thing I always I tell this to any young journalist, and I especially tell it to young journalists from underrepresented backgrounds, is get really, really, really good at something. And be the best. I was a finance reporter in the middle of the financial crisis. Nobody else looked like me who was doing what I was doing, but nobody else was as good as I was, so it was fine. But get really good at something and figure out the gap in your newsroom, whether it's the weekend shift that nobody wants to do, or the assignment nobody else wants to do. Like, become a person who is known for having a really specific talent that is not in the thing that you want to get stereotyped into, and own it. And that means you have to do more work than your colleagues, which always means you have to do more work than your colleagues. It might mean you have to do things that are not necessarily your dream, but the only way to progress in newsrooms is to get noticed by editors. And to get noticed by editors, you have to be doing the work that will hit their desk.
If you love technology,
Own
and
it.
you understand it, you can, if you own it now, you are going to be that person in the newsroom because, for example, in our newscast, there is a segment now, it's called Tech Noticias. So, you know, if you like medicine, people, I don't know why, and on the web pages, people love medical stories. And people love
Self-diagnosed.
consumer stories. But consumer stories are not as easy to do as some people think. Consumer stories are very difficult to do because they're liability issues, they're things that you have to investigate. You just can't take the word of this company that says, you know, this product is maravilloso, or, you know, or the study that came out that says that that product isn't maravilloso. There takes a lot of skill. So, like they're saying, get good at that, but there are certain topics now that are so relevant that you guys in the audience have actually made relevant because of your age. Get good at it. And then, you know, present yourself as the person in your newsroom who can do the best job.
But at the same time, is the work enough? Because we know that some folks are excellent at what they're doing, but they don't seem to interact with their newsrooms, their bosses, they don't go, they just don't feel comfortable because culturally speaking, sometimes they don't completely fit in. And then they feel that they're getting passed over for promotions or other jobs that they could have been up for. So is the work enough?
If nobody knows that you're doing good work, like you might, it's a tree falls in the forest situation, right? And I see this all the time where somebody thinks that somebody will notice. Be like, good job. I read that story you did. One of my favorite pastimes in any newsroom is to look at which the reporters are that are always emailing everyone about how awesome they are, and which the reporters are on social who are like, scoop, exclusive, me.
And Latinos aren't good at that. Latinos, we're not raised with tooting your own horn, right?
Do any of you know Adrian Carrasquillo? Okay, he's really good at that. And now he's a White House correspondent. These things are correlated. And so I think it's very important to remember that nobody is going to notice you if you don't perform the work that you are doing as well. And that can be hard. It's hard because you don't want to feel like you're bragging. It's often hard because if you're already somebody who, and you feel like you shouldn't be there, you don't necessarily want to call attention to yourself. And so something that I've seen that I do for people and that other people have done for me is like figure out who will help you amplify your work, right? Like there's always a sympathetic person who will, if you don't want to share your stories yourself, will do it for you. If you don't want to email the editor and ask to be added to the weekly herogram about which the stories were good for, like that person will do it for you. But you have to demonstrate that this is something that you want, and you have to show the willingness to speak up. Because fundamentally, if we're reporters and we can't advocate for ourselves, we'll never be able to advocate for the people that we're covering and the people that we're representing.
Well, you know, that's difficult because a lot of times I think people, a lot of it has to do with who is the news director, who is the executive producer. Look, this is a business of personalities. Right? No me oyen. Me oyen ahora? Okay. If not, I'll speak with mi voz cubana. What I was saying was, a lot of times this is not that easy. I understand what Stacey's saying.
It's not easy at all.
It's not easy. Because a lot of times, doesn't matter how many people advocate for you, it depends on the relationship with the news director or the executive producer or even just that online producer, in my case, I'm talking about television, who takes the show on the air. And if they don't like you, you know, sometimes news directors hire people and then it turns out that they don't really like them, or there isn't a connection, or there isn't chemistry, or the assistant news director is feeding things into their ear. And so es un arma de doble filo, okay? It's difficult. It's not that easy, and it is something where you're gonna have to figure out, how do you do that? How do you, you know, get noticed for your work, and that you know that you're putting your heart and soul into it. And sometimes it's just going to be a losing battle, and it'll be, you know, the contract is over and I just have to move on. So that's why I tell, you know, people all the time, your last story is your best story, and you have to keep that real, and you have to keep that resume updated, because you never know, you know, who's looking. You never know when the opportunity is going to come around. You never know, you know, when is that last day. And it's going to be harder for you to, you know, get your material out in order to update that resume reel. It's tricky. A lot of it has to do with the relationships that we have in the newsroom. People are human beings, and they come with their own prejudices. And a lot of times we have these news directors you know, que son legacy, llevan años ahí, they're there for years, and they have their own, you know, idea of what a journalist should be, how should they sound, what way should they look, where should they come from. You know, they come with that, and we're dealing with, you know, people's own personalities. And I've spoken too much now.
No, Claudia, you.
I was going to say that, you know, without maybe being deceptive about your abilities, I do think that often Latino journalists, or like people who are concerned about being pigeonholed, view their ethnicity or their culture as like as some sort of like handicap, like an obstacle in their like feet to try to get to where they want. And I think what I've learned at HuffPost, and what I've learned in what I do, is that you sometimes you do need to lean into it. You lean into the fact that you start realizing all of these things, all these perspectives, the things that you were born in, they're a very natural part of you, are what is needed and what can complement, and sometimes what the newsroom just doesn't have, and you can offer that. Whether it's Spanish, whether it's just a little more knowledge about the culture, and those things, I think, and highlighting those things instead of sometimes hiding those things is what's going to set you apart in a newsroom. So don't be afraid to also lean into your culture and be proud and be in people's faces about it, you know?
And I think that's also what we're seeing, is a shift in all these new emerging sites that are Latino-based, right? So why can we start something completely new and fresh that's about our community and not break through over here when they're claiming they want diversity in the legacy newsrooms? What is that bridge that we have to?
Do you mean like creating Latino outlets by Latinos as opposed to integrating?
Well, the reality is that probably the pay equity won't be there, right? If there's a startup. But sometimes also the reputation of what is a reputable journalist career only starts if it goes through, you know, the proper channels versus moving over here. Are there disadvantages or changes? Somebody actually asked me, there's such a track in which a journalist is supposed to follow. And I think somebody asked me yesterday, well, do they have to? Is that what they have to do now?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the schools are frankly still saying yes. Maybe not CUNY, of course, but we have students that still feel like they have, like, okay, this year here, and then I go over here, and then I go over here. And there are so many other ways. The career is no longer linear. It moves. It's like a snake now.
Yeah.
Not the people, but, you know.
Well, first of all, I think if you're talking about startups, and Carolina and I, we had this conversation, and Stacy probably knows this very well, there's a lot of startups or organizations that started Hispanic part of their organization that are no longer around. They don't exist. Yeah. And Carolina was mentioning they don't exist because there was never really a commitment. Because when you do that, you have to invest money into that. You have to invest resources, and you have to give it time so that it can start giving you back revenue, which I will never understand why in news we think that news is revenue, but, you know, business is business, and that's what it is. But, you know, so sometimes those companies don't last. What I want to say is, you know, I am from the thought of, if you love journalism, if your passion is, I want to inform, if you love medicine, if you love the economy, if you love things that have to do with the environment, my feeling is it doesn't matter where you're doing it. If you want to do that, then you're going to do it, be it at that specific company, be it small, be it, you know, specific in that And then, you know what? You continue, you get good at it, you make a name for yourself, and you continue to build your way if your idea is to go to maybe mainstream media. I'm just from the school of, if you want to do it, si lo quieres hacer, si de verdad tú tienes pasión por el periodismo, lo tienes en la sangre, tú lo vas a hacer. No importa dónde estés. It doesn't matter where you are, lo vas a hacer. Porque informar para digital es lo mismo que informar para el New York Times, porque vas a tener una audiencia que lo va a leer. Y así es como arranca la pasión del periodismo.
Yeah. I think one of the things that is really, especially for the people who are starting out or who are students or who might be starting out, I hear a lot of people say, I really want to work for BuzzFeed. I'm like, okay, there's a lot of people who work at BuzzFeed. There's a lot of desks. There are a lot of different beats. What the hell do you mean when you say, I really want to work for BuzzFeed, or I really want to work for the New York Times? Or they'll say, you know, I want to do video. Okay, do you want to do 360 video at Univision? Do you want to do social video at Vox Media? What do you mean? And also, have you ever done video? No. Have you ever written a story about the thing you say you really care about? No. Like, all right. So one of the things is, I have seen people time and again assume that because a place is a startup or because it's pure digital, the standards of entry are lower. And that's totally untrue, right? You cannot rock up to a BuzzFeed or a Vox Media or a Mic and be like, I'm great, hire me. Like, sorry, what? You know, you have to do the baseline work that you would do if you're applying to a Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. And treating it as a serious thing is step one. And the other is you need to be discoverable, right? It's very hard when I talk to people and they say, I'm super passionate about this, I care a lot about this, I want people to hire me to write about that, and they have no evidence that they've ever published any work in that thing. And I say, well, why don't you have any clips? And they say, well, I'm an entry-level person. I'm like, have you heard of the internet? You can publish things on it without somebody having to hire you. And yes, it is unfair that we have to do a lot of this work for ourselves and that we're not necessarily, there are fewer and fewer genuinely entry-level jobs in media because the baseline expertise that is required is so high, and you know, this is something that journalism schools are dealing with. But you have to do that work, and you have to do that preparation, and you have to be Googleable, right? If you're coming to me and I'm a hiring manager and I type your name into a search engine and you don't exist, it's going to be really tough for you if you don't have a portfolio, you know. So it doesn't matter if you want to start at BuzzFeed or you want to start at the New York Times, you have to have a body of work that will impress somebody who will give you that first chance.
Carolina, you're shaking your head, yes?
Yeah, no, I definitely think, I was talking to Lori and Albert before this. I've worked at a couple of NHJ job fairs actually, and I've had people come to me with a 3-page resume.
No, 1 page, please.
Wait, and no Twitter handle. And you know, obviously I work for HuffPost, so if you're going to come to me as a digital news site, you're going to come to me with a resume. You're going to need to have a Twitter, and you're going to need to put it on your resume. You're going to need to do more than retweet, and you're going to, you know, and Twitter works in amazing ways in journalism. And like Albert said, there's no rules anymore. You know, when I was going to school at NYU, some professors were like, you know, it's an interesting time for journalism. And there was like one professor who's like, it's an amazing time for journalism, and it is because it's growing. You know, since I've been at HuffPost, there's been so many changes. You know, now it's video, now it's social media, now it's, you know, all of these things coming to one, and we're always learning, as is the world. You know, so so half of that is that you need to keep track, and it is that much harder when you're not in it. But it's like you said, in Twitter, you know, you're gonna find a lot of things like job postings. You're going to find a community, and those communities are going to be your best asset, both as somebody looking for a job and once you're in the industry. I can't emphasize that enough.
And also, you know, sometimes we think, and I tell people, look, and what Stacy's saying is if you don't have a body of work, but there are some people who maybe are not interested in writing, but they want to be a producer, and they think they can just go in as a producer. But no, maybe you need to be on the assignment desk. Mm-hmm. And maybe you may go to an interview, and they say, well, you know, they're looking at your resume. I understand that you don't have any experience, but I'm willing to train. you know what, would you be interested in a junior level position on the assignment desk? Well, let me tell you, the assignment desk is a heck of a training post. Yeah. If you have never thought about it, think about it. You can learn, first of all, you become a psychologist to deal with reporters like me who's, yo no quiero hacer esa historia, why are we doing that story? Okay, so that's the first thing. And then you learn to actually figure out how you can do a story. When reporters get stuck and they're thinking, I can't do it, I don't visualize it, and they can you learn to sniff out a story, know what is a story. So what I'm saying is, maybe you're focused on, I want to be a producer, but you need to look at what else is there, because what I understand they're both are saying is, you want to put your foot in the door. Yeah. And in order to get your foot in the door, sometimes you're going to have to take something that you weren't interested in order to get to the next level.
Fun story for me. So I went to NYU and I majored in broadcast. And the only reason I ended up at HuffPost was because I came back from studying abroad, and by the time I came back, all the broadcast internships were filled, essentially, like ABC, NBC. And I had my career services person, who I was really close to, Sylvan Holloway, who, if she's here watching this, I love you. She met up with Miguel Ferrer, who at the time was in charge of Latino Voices at HuffPost, and just, Miguel mentioned to her, like, our intern for like a year is leaving, do you know anybody? And she emailed me, she's like, can I send your resume?
That's how it happened.
Yeah, and I was like, I've never thought of digital, but, let's do it. And he, they sent my resume, we did a Skype interview, and, 5 years later, I'm here.
¿Quién no conoce a Carolina?
So
that's so important, like the always be prepared thing, not to sound like a Boy Scout, but the always be prepared thing is super important. I can't tell you how many times somebody will say, or somebody will send me a job description, and I'll get in touch with somebody and say, send me the most updated version of your CV. Please update your LinkedIn profile. Like, have things that somebody who is looking out for you can send around in the world. Like, get a good headshot and stop cropping people out of selfies. Like make it easy to be recommendable. And I think sometimes we focus so much on the work that we forget that you are also your portfolio. And if I can't put you out into the world, I can't get jobs for you.
Be responsible.
Sell yourself. Know how to sell yourself.
So I actually want to keep with this a little bit, and I want to hear from you about what you think are the biggest difference, besides technology, and how journalism is being done today versus it was being done 15, 20 years ago. Whether you know about it, or you studied it in school, or you experienced it. I think especially here, because we have such an international guest list here, that it'd be interesting to kind of hear what are the parallels or the distinctions.
I probably should not start.
I don't think the journalism is very different. I don't think that the reporting is very different. I don't think that like the fundamental editorial, ethical considerations that we make as reporters and editors and producers have changed. I think the environment is wild. It is unusual for people working in US media to be in like an adversarial position to both administration and audience at the same time. Like, it's usually one or the other. And that is really unusual. And the level of scrutiny and the level of mistrust and the kinds of things that you are up against, like, you have to be so much better at your job now than ever, because the people who are waiting to come after you for any mistake is like the line is out the door.
Yeah.
Right? And so you have no wiggle room around getting things wrong. And I don't think that we as an industry have necessarily taken that as seriously as we should. I don't think we've done a particularly good job at adapting to some of the new technologies. The way, one of my obsessions is how we present headlines on social media in ways that are often extremely misleading. The fact that we fired all of our art departments and photo editors at a time when all of the formats we're trying to publish on are almost 100% visual. We made some stupid decisions that have come back to haunt us. And so I don't think that fundamentally the journalism is different. The jobs have changed, but the output and the environment are one of the biggest things for me.
Yeah, and speaking to the environment, I think obviously anybody who's worked in journalism can feel the piercing eyes of criticism from the American public. I think back in, in the day, so to speak, journalism was viewed a little, there weren't
reverence,
a little more reverence, a little more respect. Granted, there were less people and anchors to look to for news. And when television was rising, you took for granted maybe the subjectivity that came with it or the certain things that could be wrong with it. But now that we have more news sources and more anchors and more journalists, there is more accountability.
And there should be.
And there should be.
I think it's important.
And there also is more fake news. There's more. The internet is a dangerous place, and I think part of what we're learning as a society is the fact that we need to learn how to curate our news sources and how to know what's fake and what isn't. And I think we're learning all that. And I think journalism is also figuring out a way to present in a way that is the most objective, the most clear and concise, and how to make themselves stand out from what isn't real. But one thing that I do find is that we've lost is also like art departments and things like that, but also investigative journalism. A lot of those things I do think that, especially in this day and age, we need more of, and unfortunately, because of that whole perspective on that journalism is a business, and a focus on how using the internet, a lot of companies are trying to do more with less people. Unfortunately, we've lost the ability. We've lost our like the New York Times and stuff. We've lost teams that can do very important work with the right time, but also resources, and we don't have that anymore. And I hope that we find ourselves in a place again where we do.
Well, so how have things changed? I cheated because I knew we were going to talk about this. So I texted several people in different positions that started their careers right about the same time that I started mine.
You reported the story.
And I asked them, how did they think things had changed? And there was just one fundamental line with every response that I got, which is the pressure. The pressure that journalists are feeling nowadays is incredible. The pressure to be first, the pressure to get the story on first, be it on the air, digitally, with a remote camera. It's the pressure, and that a lot of times we are not saying the right thing. We don't have the complete picture, and in that pressure, they are finding that a new generation of journalists are more willing to take a shortcut. They're not willing, and sometimes, frankly, just don't have the time to take an extra step to verify something that they are reporting on. And that is what they said. They see it. Some of them were anchors that I actually spoke to. People are very free-willing with their words, with the adjectives that they used to write something. Anchors told me that they actually are going in, looking at scripts that reporters are writing, things that anchors sometimes don't do, because there is an editor or a writer there who's supposed to be doing that. And they have caught mistakes, they question things. And so it is the pressure to get it first, to get something different than what your competitor got, and then there is the time frame with which you can give the story. In television, I'm talking about maybe going from an average of doing in local news, maybe doing 1:45, to now trying to tell a story in a minute 20. Y en español eso es horrible. For every 3 words in English, it's like, 6 words in Spanish, y yo me peleo con la editora todos los días diciendo, pero ¿por qué? ¿Pero por qué? So, and so that is I would tell you, some of the biggest differences that we see from maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago to what we're seeing now. But journalism is still great.
One of the things that's interesting about that pressure and about the standards, and this fascinates me because people will often say that, you know, young people get the internet, etc. Here's two things that I've noticed that's related to both the pressure and like the time constraint, and it goes back to people who think they can just turn up a BuzzFeed or a Huffington Post with like no credentials. Just the internet is as serious as a newspaper, right? And videos that you're posting on Facebook are as serious as things that appear on NBC. And they often have substantially larger audiences, but there's a kind of casualness that I've seen people treat these media with that I don't exactly understand. It's a casualness that somebody has said to me with a totally straight face, well, I have a Facebook page, so I can be a social media strategist. Like, you have no idea what you're talking about. And I think in some newsrooms, especially in newsrooms that are run by people who came from traditional, whether it's print or broadcast, they still don't think that they have to run their social platforms with the same amount of rigor and the same amount of seriousness. I mean, you can be serious without being like boring, but it's still, the underlying seriousness is really important. And even, you know, with journalism students, I've heard this from them as well. They're like, oh, well, it's just social media, or it's like just the internet. I'm like, okay, what? So some of this pressure is we put under ourselves. We put ourselves under because we tend to think that no one will notice if we're being sloppy because we somehow think that the stakes are lower, and they're not. In some cases, they're a lot higher. If you made a mistake in a print newspaper, the next day, if somebody didn't read it that day, it was gone. You know, like the mistake was gone. If you make a mistake in a story online, it's going to stay in the story online for millions of people unless it gets corrected or retracted. And I don't think that has fully sunk in, even though it's 2017.
Let me ask you something, Stacy and Carolina. And I'm sorry, Alberto, I'm taking your job right now, but that's okay. I want to ask.
It's interactive.
But something I want to talk on, and that I continuously hear about, and it affects. I know that it's affecting a lot of Latino journalists, is when they call us activists. This whole thing about, you know, activist journalism. I don't think it's activist if I'm putting a issue out there, but I have the other side of the story. You know, so if I had, and I remember, one of the first lessons that I actually learned when I went into television was the assistant news director pulled me inside and said, look, you know what, it was a great story, everything, but tú no puedes poner a 3 personas hablando mal de Juan Martínez, okay, y poner un solo soundbite de Juan Martínez. You just got to find a way, you know, I know the writing is different and you got to figure it out. But why is it when we're talking about something, and I'm going to give you an example, maybe a temporary protective status, TPS, yesterday. It's kind of hard to find somebody to talk maybe against it. There was nobody in town, etc. But why is that activism journalism when we're putting out something that is of concern of our community, that is going to affect a large section of the community, their concern, and we're putting the other side of the story of the people who say that temporary protective status is temporary and that shouldn't be permanent, that shouldn't be extended for 18 months. Why is that activism journalism if we're putting the other side of the story and we're being fair and balanced?
I mean, my answer is that it's not. I mean, for me, I think I've never actually been accused, to be frank, about being active, you know, because I also work within HuffPost, I work with the Voices department, which means that we're intended to kind of fill in the gaps of mainstream news. So that in our perspectives, we're supposed to use our perspectives and we're supposed to use our voices, that's what they call the Voices department, to kind of show the world that there's more to a story. So for me, I've never had that, but also for me, it's always just about representation. You know, it's obviously the way you tell the story has to be professional and has to be objective, as you know, as everybody's taught in journalism school.
And she just gave the answer that I was looking for, which is you have to fill in the gap. And if you're only going to get a certain part of a story, mainstream media is not covering TPS. So the only way that the Hispanic community, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but the only way the Hispanic community is going to get information about that topic is if they hear it from CNN en Español, if they hear it from Telemundo, if they hear it from Univision, if they read it in La Opinión, aquí el diario Hoy, Un Nuevo Día. That's the only way that they're going to get it. And so I kind of like resent that a little bit when they, because we are filling in a gap and telling the story from a different angle or perspective that mainstream media maybe won't even touch on.
I think before we're actually going to go into some questions, so if you can start preparing your questions, and if you want to make a last quick statement.
Yeah, I think people use the word activism to describe anything that makes them uncomfortable. And the thing that makes people uncomfortable is when you change, when you're saying that the current representation of the status quo is not how it always has to be. And anytime you show somebody something that is not what they would have commissioned, what they would have thought of as a story that is not like them reflected back
Or what
at
they
them,
think is important.
or what they think is important, then you open yourself up to that kind of accusation, which is fundamentally disingenuous as long as what you are saying holds true, which is that we then represent the perspectives that matter. Because what I see, which gets really annoying, is when journalists, when we ourselves do not tell the whole story because it does not fit the story that we would like to tell. And then we're not particularly doing our jobs. Like, there are entire well-funded NGOs that can do that.
Yeah.
Our job is still to say, here's the whole thing as best as we know based on the reporting that we've done as objectively as we can muster.
Great, thank you. And we're going to take a first question.
Well, my name is Laura. You were talking a lot about proving yourself, like that you're good, that you can do a little bit more than what you're requested to do. In my personal case, I have been wanting to put my foot in the door, as you have said, and I have the feeling that getting started here is kind of starting over. Even though I have experience in my country, coming here is like good for what you did. It's a great experience, personal experience, but what you have in your resume, it kind of is not counting that much. I created my own website, which is based on short news, and I try to like be prepared and go record, edit, and have everything. But right now that I have been going through all the process of applications and getting started and everything, I have found that like that part of showing that you are prepared and that you want to take the chance and that you want to, get us started, it's really hard because they're like, oh, where have you been published? And I'm like, in my website. Yeah. So it's really hard to get it started, like what to do when you want to start over.
Are you talking about you've done it in Spanish and you're trying to get into the Spanish?
Yeah, I'm trying to get
in,
in Spanish.
Okay, and which was a question I was going to ask is how easy or hard, difficult is it to get into these markets? Difficult?
I think one of the things that I see often, because I've hired for a lot of different jobs, and I've looked at maybe in the tens of thousands of resumes and applications. And the thing that people get wrong all the time is they don't tell me why I should care. They will list awards, they will list that they have a website, they won't tell me anything about audience, they won't tell me anything about the scope of the work, the type of the work. There's a lot of tell but not show. And when you are trying to break into a new market, where if it's a different country, if it's a different industry, you have to do more translation of your stuff. Because things, like people who come from journalism who are trying to break into technology, or vice versa, have to show how the skills that they developed in one context are relevant to the job that they're applying to now. And that's not always easy, but it's very important. Because you need to be able to help me understand, hey, I know that I've only published on my websites, but I built it myself, I managed my time, I had these deadlines, or like this was how people responded to my stories, which is a more compelling thing to put in your cover letter than just listing what you were. Or for people who are, I come from a tiny island that very few people have heard of, and so stuff that I've done there might not necessarily resonate until I tie it back to, this was the biggest story, this was on the front page of the national newspaper, which is still an audience of 1 million. So like helping people understand the context that is not always clear is really important.
And we have a couple more questions, so I'm going to go through the questions, and then we're going to be here for a little longer, so you can always come and talk to us right after as well. Okay, next question.
I want to thank the panelists for sharing your time and your experiences, but Alberto, my question is for you, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, put on the spot.
I'm back.
Overall, not just Latinos, but overall diversity in newsrooms continues to stagnate. If NAHJ is supposed to be our advocate on this issue, what does it say about your effectiveness in the rest of the unity groups?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, NHJ's been around for, it's 34 years. And I think that even when we started, if we look at the percentage of Latinos in newsrooms then and where we are now, unfortunately, not much has changed. I think the organization has had its ups and downs, but now what we're trying to do is do more to keep our members in their jobs. So we're going to focus more on making sure that there's training and that there's available so you have a skill set that keeps you a lot more relevant. Another component we're changing is we have done a lot for students with scholarships, some internships, but it hasn't been consistent. And so one of the things we're working on directly is with the networks to actually get these kids placed, because once they get placed, chances are they're going to rise to the top and actually get hired. Right now, our students and some of our members don't even get through the first round of HR because the competition of who's evaluating the resumes doesn't even account for who they are and what they're representing. So we actually are on the upswing. At the end of 2011, we ended up with about just under 800 members. Now we're back up to 2,100 members in about 5 years. I think everything that's happened politically has brought an increase in interest in being a part of something. But we still have a lot of opportunities for growth. And one of the biggest things that we're going to be doing also is really doing more for our journalists that work in the Spanish language markets, because that's something that really is an opportunity for us.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for sharing all your stories and advice. I have a question specifically under the assumption that you're working for an English language outlet, and you're one of the only Latino or Latina in the newsroom. How do you, which...
Yes. How can I help you?
You're listening. How do you quantify the skills that you're bringing into that medium that possibly no one else has? Maybe it's Spanish. Maybe it's the cultural competency. It's the understanding of a culture and multiple cultures. Sometimes, how do you make sure that you're not you're actually being compensated for work that is not even under your description, but you're probably going to have to do it because of who you are, that probably the rest of the newsroom won't ever have to worry about?
Like HR.
Yeah, so I mean, I was with you until the end because obviously what I am paid to be the token person in my company. I mean, I am. I work for Latino Voices, so that is my whole shtick. So I will say though that I do know a lot of people that aren't Latinos. For example, we have somebody who is a hijab wearing woman, and she sometimes it's like the person who gets with feels like there's a lot of resting on her shoulders as far as like Islam and all these Islamophobia coverage. So I don't have a great answer for you. I think it's a matter of from what I've heard from other people, it's a matter of they feel the need to do this for their community, and they are seen as important people in the newsroom because obviously it's such a big topic right now, and there needs to be somebody. With that said, there doesn't seem to be enough of a need that they can hire more people. But
I can give a little bit of perspective on this. So I speak French fluently, and during the various terrorist attacks around European capitals, me and any other French speakers and any Arabic speakers were drafted in on top of our newsroom editing normal jobs. But at the end of it, we said, hey, these stories wouldn't have happened if all of these people didn't stay awake for 5 straight days, if we didn't have the 2 Arabic speakers come into the Slack and do these things. And I've seen colleagues, especially some my black colleagues, who there's an internal mailing list around race sensitivity, and there were a handful of people who were always asked hey, is this racist? And usually if you have to ask, the answer is yes. And so there were people who were doing this kind of work, and one of the things that me and some other managers did is we sat down and we quantified how much time people were spending doing things outside of their job description. And in some cases we got pay rises for people who were doing this consistently or extra holiday, but you need to be able to say, if I didn't do this, this wouldn't have happened.
Right.
And you need to be very clear about, in the last 7 stories, I contributed translations, even though that's not what I was responsible for. Because if you don't keep track, it's going to be hard to measure that back up the chain. And so the more specific you can be about if I weren't here, this wouldn't happen. Like, the better it will be when you are having these conversations with your manager.
Yeah. And don't be afraid. Don't be afraid.
So
Yeah.
the last, I just wanted to get you guys' opinion on the Media Matters study, because you talked, Lori, about 2008 when Obama became president. Like, all of a sudden, people of color were on TV. Now that there's another president and the Latino vote supposedly didn't show up, which is
Yeah.
a crock, now there's lack of Latino voices. Like, all of a sudden, the networks are like, if you've seen it, I mean, and you're talking progressive networks, you know, count the 5 white males on Lawrence O'Donnell. It happened last night with Larry Melber. And what do journalists, people in broadcast, people that are voices, like, besides just screaming and yelling and saying you guys are being racist right now? And yes, the answer is yes. Media is racist. What do you do? I mean, what do you do about the lack of Latino voices that are not showing up on mainstream English language broadcasts right now?
Do you want to start?
Porque ustedes me miran a mí.
Hey, he has a broadcast. What do I do? I mean, like I said earlier, I'm very loud in my newsroom. So I'm very unapologetic about pointing out the lack of diversity, and I'm not really here to babysit people's feelings about whether or not it makes them uncomfortable. Because I feel like if you're going to talk the talk, you're going to walk the walk. And as a progressive news site, you need to do that.
And we come to panels like this.
Yes,
You
and
know, we come out
mentorship.
and we mentor people, but we also come to panels like this. And when you have an opportunity, as I have had, to talk to people who are in other positions in networks that can bring the attention to other people, you bring it up. It's an uncomfortable topic, but you bring it up every time you get a chance in a respectful manner, not in a combative manner. It's not a militant issue. It is just something that is reality. You know, before I leave here, you guys can look around. Look at who's sitting next to you. You don't see a lot of people, and this has nothing to do with the conference. It's just a reality. Okay, there's not a lot of people that look like me, even in Hispanic television. We're coming along, and there's more. But and when I have a young lady who comes and says to me, "Pero tú crees que yo?" Entonces she me hace así.
Looking for the time.
No.
I'm just kidding.
No. ¿Tú crees que yo puedo encontrar trabajo? That hurts.
Yeah.
That hurts. And you know, it's a longer conversation. It is it's glacier moving. It's an uphill battle. It's an ongoing cycle that I just don't understand. Why is it that we're still dealing with this, and why is it that 20 years later we're still talking about the fact that there's just not enough of anything?
Yeah.
And part of the battle is be bookable, right? If you want to be quoted as a source, and you don't have a profile that somebody can find when they're like frantically Googling who talks about things, if you don't know who any producers are, if you when they find you, you have no clips, you have no example of like things that you can talk about, like be findable, right? Because some people are looking, and the most annoying thing I hear from newsrooms all the time is like, well, we couldn't find anybody. So like, don't give them the excuse that they couldn't find anybody. Like, be as visible as you can be.
And you know what? It doesn't have to be nationally. It could be in your own local community. You know, there's public affairs shows on radio and on television, on cable. You know, be accessible. Become a person that, you know, a source that they can go to.
Okay. Claudia, you have a last word?
No, I was just going to say that, I was just going to say that for me at least, my biggest allies have been other people of color and other marginalized communities, people who kind of feel the same way about diversity. So don't be afraid also, just like also as a country, obviously, we're finding that we need to be as united as ever as marginalized communities. And I think that also translates to the newsroom. We have to figure out a way to come together and kind of speak for our communities together and work together as allies.
And I will say that it's probably one of the reasons why also a lot of our members come back to the National NHJ Conference, which will be in September, September in Anaheim and July. And because they actually talk about these horror stories, They end up finding community. They end up finding resources. They end up finding opportunities to go into other jobs. And so I think finding our community is always our strength, and I think that's where we always get our biggest sense of, okay, I'm ready, let's go to battle.
And look, I only have the last word, but I want to say something. A lot of people tell you, well, do you know of anybody who ever got a job because they went to an NAHJ conference? Yes, I know several people who've gotten jobs who are still working today. One of those young ladies was an intern in my office. She went to the NAHJ conference and she did, you guys have like the little reporters, it's
Not little student newsrooms.
student
project.
There's a student project. She did that project, okay, and realized the potential that she had, okay, and today she has a job and she's working, and she's not the only one. I know several people that have found jobs through NAHJ.
Great. Thank you very much,
Muchísimas gracias.
everybody. Thank you.